Hello, and may the 4th be with you. I am here, Mark from Enchantment of Eternity, to start a tradition where I review a different Star Wars movie every year on May the 4th, which has become the official Star Wars holiday, even though it's a bit silly that May the 4th is like a play on words, get it, ha ha ha. But it's actually becoming like a huge thing. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if this eventually becomes an official holiday. Like, everywhere is playing Star Wars music and there's big celebrations. So that's quite amazing that they're making this a holiday out of it. But anyway, I thought I'd start my own May the 4th tradition where I review a Star Wars movie every year. Of course, this is the first year, so I am starting with the first Star Wars movie. No, not that one. That's not really the first Star Wars movie, is it? That's just the one that's the prequel that shows you what happened, what came before the movies we know. No, the first Star Wars movie is this one, which is called Star Wars. That's what it's called. It is called Star Wars. Now, if you say, hey, I'm watching Star Wars, someone else might be like, which one? Which Star Wars? So you have to differentiate it. Of course, A New Hope. But when this first came out, it wasn't called A New Hope. It was called Star Wars. It wasn't until they started working on Empire Strikes Back they retroactively put in Episode 4, A New Hope. But that Episode 4, even the title New Hope was not there originally. But just so to differentiate it, so you know which Star Wars I'm talking about, I am talking about A New Hope, which is the first Star Wars movie. Really. So I had decided to go in order of release date rather than episode order, because really, I mean, I could go in episode order, or I could go in like machete order or whatever bullshit, other shit. But I think release date's better, because the prequels are prequels. And I know that I'm pretty sure there's some people out there who actually watch the Star Wars movies for the very first time in episode order. And I just imagine that they'd be confused, because the prequels were like made for an audience who were already aware of the original Star Wars trilogy. It's freaking obvious every time I watch it. So anyway, I'm going in order of release date. So we're starting with episode 4, A New Hope, or Star Wars. So, I guess I'll start with my personal relationship with this movie, or my personal experience. Now, like I would assume the majority of you watching this video right now, I was born after this movie came out. Not by much, though. I was alive when the sequels Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi came out, but I was really too young to really understand or fully get it. I'm pretty sure I have some memories of seeing Return of the Jedi in the theater and being like, Ewoks, because I was 4 years old. I was pretty much the right age for the Ewok side of things. But I'll touch more on that when I get to Return of the Jedi. Point is that I didn't really, I've watched bits and pieces of all the Star Wars movies growing up, but I sort of saw the trilogy as a whole. I never was, introduced to this movie first, and then thought of, oh, this is the only thing Star Wars ever, and I had to wait years, and oh, there's another sequel, oh, and there's a sequel after that, because really growing up, I had all 3 movies to begin with, which, again, is probably true for the majority of you watching this video. But I think it makes a difference, because it wasn't until I was 11 or 12 that I really started to watch these movies in order from start to finish, in the proper order, and really began to understand and appreciate them. I mean, throughout my childhood, I would watch bits and pieces, and I had all the Star Wars toys and whatnot, and all that sort of thing, but I don't think I really got into them until about that age. And around that age, I decided that I did not like this movie here, A New Hope, that much. That it was my least favorite of the trilogy, and that I actually preferred the 2 sequels, Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, which I actually watched repeatedly more often than I watched this one. And I think I pretty much, as an adult all these decades later, I think I pretty much still maintain that viewpoint, that I do believe this is the weaker of the Star Wars trilogy. But I have to, again, you have to look at it from the mindset of when this film first came out. There was no sequels, and there would be no sequels if this film wasn't such a hit and success. I could understand those who were alive and old enough to remember this and understand this film when it first came out, having a different perspective and more sort of nostalgia over this film in particular. How this was the, not just the first Star Wars, but in their worldview, this was it. This was the only Star Wars. And then later, more Star Wars came out. But this was always be, Star Wars to everyone. Which, as I said, for me, wasn't my opinion. So I have a different view on that. So anyway, I do still, of course, appreciate this film. Just honestly not as much as the other two in the original trilogy. So, this film was made as sort of an homage. It was inspired by a lot of things, but one of the things brought up a lot in documentaries and by George Lucas himself is Flash Gordon. It was meant to be a very exciting sort of serial. It was like a return to swashbuckling action adventure, and they decided to set it in space. And George Lucas also, mentioned being inspired by like pirate movies and all these other movies of swashbuckling, family fun adventure movies, which they feel wasn't really a thing in the 70s. That most of the movies coming out in the 70s, particularly science fiction ones, were like dire or dark or bleak, had a bleak message, Planet of the Apes, 2001: The Space Odyssey, Zardos. So most of the movies come out were like around this time were not very family friendly, adventure like, and so. Because Lucas first thought of this idea and first pitched to the studios in the early 70s, like 72, 73, I believe. So he was wanting to, it was before Close Encounters came out. So he was wanting to revive that sense of adventure. And see, that's something I had to realize because I grew up in the 80s where that sense of family fun adventure was very commonplace. E.T., Back to the Future, Goonies, what have you. It was everywhere, Karate Kid. But it's because of Star Wars that became such a huge thing. Mainly. In fact, Star Wars is generally known as the first blockbuster. But they had that, Flash Gordon inspiration, and I think that Flash Gordon is silly and ridiculous. And here's the thing. It's okay if you have something that's silly and ridiculous as your baseline inspiration, but then you do something similar that's inspired by it, but completely different and completely better. I mean, that's fine. But I think there's aspects of this movie in particular, especially a lot more so than the sequels Empire and Jedi. Like, there was a scene with Grand Moff Tarkin where Leia says something, I don't know the direct quote, but she says something like, "Oh, I thought I recognized your foul stench when I came on board, and I see you're still holding Vader's leash, blah, blah." And I watched an interview recently with Carrie Fisher, from a while ago, where she talked about that line and said, that people don't talk like that. And they don't. That seems a bit like, and that's not the only example. There's bits throughout the entire movie that seem a bit Flash Gordon-ish to me, that weren't actually really in the sequels. I think the sequels are actually written better. This it kind of reminds me a lot, being a Star Trek fan, of the Voyager episode where they had Captain Proton, which was, again, that was a whole thing making fun of schlock sci-fi like Flash Gordon, where they have the fiendish cleverness of blah blah, and I can recognize some of that ridiculous dialogue in lines like that. Now, granted, it's nowhere near as bad again, I'm not saying it's as bad or silly as Flash Gordon. Clearly it's not. But there are aspects of that kind of shine through that was like, oh, this is evil. And part of that, of course, had to do with Lucas making this viable for the studios. That he had to pitch it to the studios and he had to work within the studio system. So he had to sort of paint it as this good versus evil story. But you can kind of tell that he had a baseline that was a lot more complex, that he had thought this story through a lot more, like it mentions through the Galactic Senate and stuff like that. It's just he couldn't really do that because he needed to do something that would be a big blockbuster and like make a lot of money. And then once it was a huge blockbuster, in fact a lot of people call it the first blockbuster, and it made tons of money, he had more freedom to do it his way, to do it the way he wanted to, which is why I think Empire and Jedi are a lot more complex, and they don't come off as simple or as silly as this one does, which is why I prefer them. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with a very simplistic action adventure film that the whole family can enjoy. And I think this film does pull that off extremely well. And I think this is a very enjoyable film. But I think it's limiting. Like, I think a film like that is sort of simplistic is mainly appealing to general audiences, and therefore it can't really rise above. But that being said, there are elements of this film that are built in that Lucas sort of snuck in there that are more complex, that are in the background, but they're able to set up more for these sequels, and also another reason why they succeed so well. Like, another example that I find really cheesy is the ending scene where they're all giving medals. And there's like everyone's cheering and they're giving medals, and the Princess Leia's dressed, looking all pretty and put the medals, and they all smile, and they have these goofy, cheesy smiles, and yeah, that's really cheesy. That's really 70s-ish. It's not really the complex. Like, you compare that ending to the end of Empire, which is like, we're all fucked. And it's like a lot more complex. It's a lot more adult. There's a lot more to it than that. And this seems very sitcom-ish. Very 70s-ish. Very like childish and cheesy. And George Lucas says, and he's been saying this all along, that Star Wars was made to appeal to children, but I think the more accurate thing is family audience, that it can appeal for the whole family, which I think is evident in Empire and Jedi, which are more mature and have a lot more themes that can still be enjoyed by children. I mean, Ewoks, come on. But to me, there's more complexity to them. And I think, again, part of the reason why he couldn't do that is because he had to work more in the studio system. But also, this was the first thing. And as far as he knew, this movie would bomb. I mean, that's something he talks about a lot. That he didn't know if he'd be able to do more. Like, so, because George Lucas originally, he talked about how he wrote Star Wars, and he realized it was way too big to do in one film, so he decided to do a third of it. And to make this movie was just the first third. So basically he wrote the Star Wars trilogy. And so he had in mind that he always wanted to do the other 2/3 of this story. He always considered this 1/3, but that's not how he could. That's just his personal, mindset. He couldn't really pitch it to the studio that way because it's not. Probably could nowadays with all the freaking franchises and all the bullshit. But back then, he couldn't really. He had to say just sell it as a singular movie. and that if he was lucky and if he did a great job and it was successful, then he'd be able to finish telling his story. But he had to focus on and show this as a singular story. And I think there's a lot of aspects of, because that's the way the studio looked at it, and the studio had a lot of story control over this film. That's the way they looked at it, and that's why in many ways this film doesn't link up as well to the other films, particularly like the films that came much later, the prequels. And, you know, the most obvious example of this is the whole Luke and Leia thing. How they had to sell it as a romance. You watch the trailer that came out in the 70s, so it's like, in a romance for the ages, because that's how they had to sell it. And Lucas had come out later on record saying that he did not know, even though he wrote, like, he had the sequels in mind, a lot of those has changed. Like, he originally did not know that Luke and Leia would be brother and sister. That's, in fact, something he said that he changed for Return of the Jedi. In fact, he said in Empire, when they had that line, there is another Skywalker, he was setting up for episodes 6, 7, and 8. Or, sorry, 7, 8, and 9, sorry. Because his idea was had to do these episodes 7, 8, and 9, and that he'd introduce Luke's sister, who would become a huge character. But when it came time to do Return of the Jedi, he was tired and exhausted, and there was a lot of circumstances, a lot of headaches, a lot of issues behind the scenes of making these films, and he just didn't want to do it anymore, and he decided that Return of the Jedi would be it, and he sort of scrapped his plans to do episodes 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 9. But originally, like, when this movie was a huge success and a huge hit, he was like, oh great, now I can make more. And he didn't want to just stop at the trilogy, and that's why he called this episode 4, like right before Empire came out, because his plan was to do 9 episodes, do the first 3 and do the last 3. But again, it was too much for him, and he was like, "Now fuck that." But then he was stuck with having 4, 5, and 6, and nothing before. So, but he needed to spend time with his family, which makes a lot of sense. And apparently, he was having a lot of family problems, which makes sense if you look at how much work had to go into making these movies. That he was probably never at home ever. So you can kind of understand that. And so, but decades later, after his children were grown up and he had more time on his own, he was decided, well, since I called this episode 4, 5, and 6, I really need to do 1, 2, and 3. So he went back and did 1, 2, and 3, which, you know, we'll get 2 years from now. That's a whole nother thing. But he had no plans of doing 7, 8, 9 at that stage, because he was like, look, you know, because originally all the way back in 1980 or even 1979, he wanted to do 7, 8, 9, but you know, because it was decades of nothing, and he went back to it, it was like, I'm tired, I don't want to do that. But then it was kind of set up that way, so Disney bought it, and they did 7, 8, 9. And again, that's something, it's a discussion for another time. Just like Maz Kanata said. It's a discussion for another time. Maz Kanata, God, that's stupid. Anyway, it is interesting looking at some of the behind-the-scenes stuff that was going on, because as I mentioned, there was a lot of issues, particularly with this film. That its production, it was supposed to come out in winter of 1976 originally, but the production was delayed and took so long because of bad weather in the desert, and like pretty much they talk about everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Like, even in post-production, they were talking about how he had to fire the editor because the editor wasn't, like, sort of having his vision. They were saying on set that his director of photography wasn't getting along with him and didn't like his style of direction, because he kept trying to sort of quote-unquote do his job for him and say, hey, let's put a light there. And the guy's like, you don't tell me where to put a light. I tell you where to put a light. You just tell me what your vision is. And going through film school, I really identify that with that, because that's sort of a different... I can see, because I saw firsthand how different heads can sort of clash on that, and be if you try too much to do someone else's job. But then again, everyone has different styles, because I'm sure George Lucas was used to working with other DPs who are perfectly okay with saying, why don't you put a light there? It's like, okay, good idea, I'll try putting a light there. But other DPs are a bit more sort of precious and be like, well, that's not your freaking job. You're the director, not the director of photography. So, well, anyway, that was one thing that was interesting. It's also interesting to hear that he fired the editor because he didn't think the editor got his vision and got his sense, and again wasn't really listening to him. And so and it's interesting to hear, like, he said that he was also having problems with the special effects. He's saying that at first the special effects, like, they went through most of their budget, like over budget, and the special effects sucked, which is hard to imagine, seeing how groundbreaking they ended up being. So basically he was saying that everything was going wrong. The only aspect that was perfect from the start was the music, the John Williams score. And I can see that because the music does really elevate this film, like, a lot. I mean, the music is probably one of the most recognizable, the most, it's what made this film. Like, if you have this exact same film, but a musical score that's either mediocre or even worse, not very good, then I don't think you would have had a huge blockbuster hit. I don't think you would have Empire Strikes Back. I don't think you'd have this huge saga. Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement, but I think, because oh, Mark, that's stupid, the special effects and the story, and sure, it would have connected with some people, but not everyone. I think the music is what you remember most. The huge, like, glaring music is what carries a lot of these scenes, and so I can definitely see how Lucas thought that, yeah, the music was the only thing that went right from the beginning. But yeah, when it actually came out, of course, it was a huge hit, and they were shocked. Like, they were surprised. Like, the studio itself, like, they kind of gave up on this movie, and they were like, they wanted, like, to scrap it, but they'd already put so much money in. It was like, all right, well, let's put this thing out. And I remember I watched this thing recently where a lot of movie theaters didn't even want to play this movie. They said it played in, like, something like 90 movie theaters in the U.S. on this opening day. That is mind-boggling. Of course, you do have to remember there were less movie theaters back then, and they didn't have huge opening days in the 70s the way we do in modern times. But still, and they actually said that a lot of movie theaters refused to buy it because they thought it would flop. And that Fox had to, like, make a deal where this other movie, which I've never even heard of in my life, that shows how well that movie aged, that the theaters did want to play, and are like, look, if you want to play this movie, you gotta play Star Wars too. And that's how they managed to get the 90 theaters. And that's fucking amazing. And I'd love to see, I can kind of see, like, from retrospect, from our perspective, seeing how what a huge, outrageous, like, there's a whole holiday devoted to it now, phenomenon Star Wars has become, how stupid and ridiculous those people are. But if you try to look at it from their perspective, all the way back in the, in the 70s, I could see how this could look a bit silly, because there's a lot of movies, and granted, most of them I'm thinking it probably came out after Star Wars and we're trying to rip it off, that has, like, a similar concept with, like, funky futuristic costumes in the evil empire, and the emperor is gonna be evil, and dudes having sets where it's supposed to be a space station, dudes wearing these funny looking uniforms, and, like, a lot of puppets and stuff in the background, that it could look silly. And a lot of the actors, particularly Alec Guinness, were saying that they expected this movie to fail, that it looked silly to them. It just, a lot of people involved in, like, extras and location shoots were like, this looks ridiculous. And so I can kind of get in that mindset. But another thing, like the documentary mentioned, which I thought was quite brilliant, is that before this movie even came out, they kind of reached out to the science fiction community and hyped it up there. They had like a novel come out like a year before the movie came out, and they had a whole bunch of comic books and stuff. And that's why I think it was such part of the reason, anyway, why it was such a hit, because they managed to hype it up properly. And not even, and we get this whole conversation about how George Lucas like swindled the studios basically by getting almost all the rights to the merchandising, which made more money than the movies ever did. And because at this stage in the 70s, merchandising wasn't really a thing. They was like, oh, you're going to sell toys? No one's going to sell toys. And they sold so much toys when the movie first came out that they didn't have enough. That the toy company had to like put out vouchers, everyone, saying, all right, we'll get you toys later because we just can't make enough for everyone right now. I mean, it just shows you how mind-blowing everything was. But anyway, getting back to the movie itself, yes, there were amazing, groundbreaking special effects, which hold up. I mean, even though I know the version I watched was the stupid special edition that was tweaked in the 90s, but the CGI added actually make it a bit worse. To be honest, like the original like model stuff from the 70s actually holds up better than that CGI stuff they added in the late 90s. I mean, and a lot of special effects. It's like it is like what special effects is like. It really was groundbreaking in that man, and won tons of awards and totally deserved to. And I'm thinking particularly of that, the whole scene in particular at the end with the dogfight scene with the X-Wings going through the Death Star. Like, that was done very well. And that was also modeled off of a lot of World War II movies and, the whole dogfight thing. But the way they integrated it into the story was actually very good. Like I've even now on this rewatch, even though I've seen this movie dozens of times before, I was really engaged. It was like really intense. The way they built up to it, it just really worked. Now, watching this movie in retrospect is a bit different, though. If I do kind of look at all the sequels and prequels and everything that came out after it, again, you see a lot of things that don't match up, like the whole Leia thing. And I don't know, like, Lucas said that he did have a plan that Vader was Luke's father the whole time. But again, when they were making this movie, they had to make this movie. He didn't know for sure that there'd ever be sequels. And again, the studio had a lot of say, and they didn't know what his plans were. So there were scenes where it doesn't really match up that Vader tries to kill him in the X-Wing dogfight, for example. And also, of course, Lucas didn't even know that Leia would be Vader's daughter, because Darth Vader's hanging around Princess Leia for like most of this movie, and he's not able to sense that she's his daughter, yet he can sense that Luke's his son. And fucking Empire Strikes Back, come on now. Not even to get into the prequels of, I don't see, and then Rogue One as well, like Rogue One and Solo, for example, like Han Solo definitely doesn't match up, like he's but that's more of a problem with those movies. And that's why I don't think we need those movies. Even though I do like Rogue One, I think it's a good movie. I don't like the fact that it's about the stolen plans of the Death Star that feeds right into this film. Basically, like the very last scene of Rogue One is the first feeds. It's like it happened a minute before the first scene of this film. You didn't need to do that. I'm sorry. I mean, I did appreciate Rogue One for its original characters and its warlike aspect to Star Wars, making it feel more like a war movie than any other Star Wars movie did. But they should have set it someplace else. They didn't need. They're trying too hard. And same with Solo. You could have a whole nother bounty hunter, a whole nother smuggler character. You don't need to keep feeding off of this one movie. But anyway, I'm getting a bit sidetracked here. But Another thing that's really interesting, one thing in particular that's interesting to look at in retrospect is the whole Vader versus Obi-Wan scene. Now, this is kind of getting back into the cheesiness of the Flash Gordonness of it all. I'm the teacher. Let's see. Ha ha ha. It seems like the teacher or the student has now become the teacher. And they're just sitting there poking each other with these lightsabers going goo goo goo. And you compare that to the better lightsaber battles, which I'm not going to mention because I don't want to get everyone furious at me, but one in particular, which most people say isn't a lightsaber battle, which actually is. They're not going to get into that. Way better than boo, 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 boo. Now, the prequel ones, a lot of people say the prequel battles are better than this one, but I don't know. This seemed like a dance to me. They're too well choreographed, I would say. But I don't know. Like, this one is... And plus, as I said, like, the writing in this, it just... You compare this to, say, the Battle of Obi-Wan versus Anakin and Revenge of the Sith. Like, I actually love that fight scene. I think it's amazing. And part of the main reason why, and is because of the emotional weight behind it. Like, you feel the emotion, you feel the hurt, you feel the pain in Obi-Wan. Whereas here, like, you should still have that. This is 20 years, and this is the first time they're meeting, and Darth Vader should have this like intense hatred towards Obi-Wan for leaving him for dead. And this, again, remember, this is the backstory Lucas has thought of from the very beginning. So he knew from even when making this film, well, maybe not when making this film, definitely when making Empire, but maybe even when making this film, what the backstory was that Obi-Wan left Vader for dead. And you think that Vader would be furious over him and it's like, oh, you left me for dead, I'm gonna fucking kill you. And Obi-Wan's being like, you fucking killed all the other Jedi, which is something they mentioned specifically in this film, so you know they already thought of that backstory, that Obi-Wan would have been more like, angry and had more emotional weight. You betrayed us, you killed all the Jedi. But instead they're like, oh, now the student has become the teacher. Blue, 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 blue. And so it just, and it has that Flash Gordon cheesiness to me, in my opinion. Plus, let's not even get into the whole fact that Obi-Wan just lets Vader kill him, and I will become more powerful. Why? They're becoming a voice in Luke's head? You're more powerful? Actually, no, Obi-Wan. I think you could have done more if you were still alive than just being a voice in Luke's head. I think you actually could have accomplished a fuck ton more. But that's just me. And, alright, so while I'm at the whole negatives of it, let me get into the first act, which honestly I always thought was boring. That's one of the main reasons, particularly when I was 11, 12 years old, I didn't like this film as much as Empire Jedi, because this part drags, to be perfectly honest. And even watching it as an adult, you say, oh, you're just a silly kid, 12-year-old who's really impatient and doesn't like, can't just sit through a movie. But as an adult, like, I see it in a different perspective, but more from the perspective of this is poorly paced. It is bad pacing. It's like, particularly when I'm talking about, is it after the huge fight, which is a great way to open the film. I gotta be honest about that. Like, that was an amazing way to open the film, and that's what sold a lot of people. Like, they sat in this theater, oh, we're gonna see some space action movie, and they start off with boom, the ship's, fucking Star Destroyer, like, shooting after the ship, and all these people firing, and like, holy shit, this is nothing we've seen before. It was a great way to start the film. But after that scene, you go to fucking C-3PO and R2-D2, and C-3PO is like, oh, go that way, I don't want to go this way, you go that way. And it shows them just wandering through the desert for what seems like half an hour. I know it's probably only like 5 minutes, but it seems like a half an hour because it's boring. I'm sorry, it is. And R2-D2 and the fucking Jawas go, no, this is Spaceballs reference, but anyway, they fucking kill R2-D2 and they take him around, and the Jawas are going around, and you see all these funky little droids, blah, 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 blah. This is so boring. And I honestly think that is a down point of this film, even to this day. Now, for the first time, very first time in my entire life, yesterday when I watched this film, I finally saw a deleted scene, which I had heard of before, but I've never seen it because Disney Plus had it in their extras. A deleted scene where Luke meets up with his friends and he sees Biggs. Now, I've heard of this scene before because in the special editions, which is the only version you're able to watch now, unless you're very, inquisitive and resourceful, but basically, the only version you can watch now is special editions. They added the scene back in towards the end of the film when they meet up at the Alliance with Biggs. He's like, "Hey, Luke, great to see you." And I remember when I first saw the special editions for the very first time, all the way back in 1997, when they added that scene, I'm like, why the fuck are they adding this scene where Luke is reunited with Biggs and not the scene where he meets Biggs in the first place? Because we as the audience have no fucking idea who Biggs is. And I felt so disconnected. I'm like, I don't know this guy. I don't care about this guy. Why the fuck are they showing it to me? And I think this is a huge downfall of the special editions, because either don't put that scene in or put both scenes in. It makes no sense to put one scene and not the other. But anyway, getting back to the very original cut, when I watch this deleted scene, I can see. So the scene shows Luke looking in the telescope, whatever, and he can see the ships fighting up in space. And he goes over to his friends, like, "Look, I see the ships fighting in space." And yeah, whatever. And then he gets set aside and talks to Biggs, and Biggs went to this academy, and it's like, "Oh, I'm so jealous of you. You get to venture. I'm stuck here on this rock." And Biggs is talking about how he's going to join the Alliance, and Luke is really jealous, and he's like, "Don't worry, one day we're going to meet up and join the Alliance." And so when you have that other scene where they do meet up right before they attack the Death Star, that makes that scene so much more better, because you set up for it with this guy he admired and looked after and looked up to, and they finally get to meet to take on the Death Star, and plus you see Biggs during the Death Star fight and he dies. And at the moment, even with that second scene in there, zero impact, makes no sense. So it would have made a lot more sense. In fact, I think it would have been great storytelling had they left that first scene in. But I'm going to get into an even stronger reason why they should have left that scene in, is because it would have broken up that boring first part. Because these scenes, and I think this is why they cut them out, because these scenes were originally supposed to take intercut between the fighting with Leia and the stuff going on with C-3PO and R2-D2 running through the desert, and that would have been our first introduction to Luke Skywalker. So I think the reason why they cut him out is because they wanted our first introduction to Luke Skywalker to be when R2-D2 and C-3PO see him for the first time at his home, when they buy the droids and they play the music as soon as he appears, and they go, "Luke, Luke," which, don't get me wrong, that is a great introduction to the character, and arguably a better one than this deleted scene. But I can see the reasoning, but I still strongly disagree with it, because I still think that this scene would have greatly improved the film, because it would have broken up that boring ass. Because for the longest time, and not only is it boring just watching R2-D2 C-3PO going, "Go that way, blah blah blah." Not only is that boring, but these are the only characters we know. These are the only ones we're following, because we're not following Vader and Leia anymore. I think we might flash back to him once or twice, but they won't really care about that. We're really following the droids. We need more. If you would have introduced Luke earlier, then we would have had more to think about, more to feast on, and it would have set us up. Oh, we know that these characters are going to meet eventually. How they're going to meet, it would have been better storytelling. I think it would have served the film better. I wonder if that's something the original editor wanted to do, that Lucas fired. Maybe not. I don't know. But that's what I think should have done. Even though, I saw this for the very first time. God, let's see. I guess the last thing I want to talk about with this film, which again, don't get me wrong, I still do really like this film. But the last thing I want to talk about is how it is, and I kind of talked about this already, but it's kind of the classic hero's journey. It is a swashbuckling adventure that apparently was kind of forgotten in the 70s at this stage, but it's also, like Lucas talked about writing this film, and this one in particular, about how he tried so hard to make it apply to multiple cultures. Like, he didn't want it like to be too specific to any one culture, so he took inspiration from a lot of legends, of a lot of stories of history, like people said, like King Arthur, or freaking just a lot from a lot of different cultures. And in fact, God, there was this one guy's name who they name dropped in Honest Trail. I can't remember it, but he wrote he was like a professor or something. He wrote a lot of literary, like nonfiction novels about that's studying, the epic mythology story and whatnot of multiple cultures, and George Lucas actually consulted with him when writing the script, which is because, and he wanted to make sure that it was like universal. So in that way, I think that's a good and bad thing, because it's a bad thing because it's a bit more recognizable, it's a bit more simplistic, and it's a bit more something we've seen before, but he puts his own, of course, space twist to it, which makes it a bit more original. My argument is, however, is that he puts even more of a twist to the sequels to Empire Jedi, that they get much, much better. Because they put even more of a twist to it, and they're able, again, he has more freedom to do whatever he wants, and he's not as beholden to the studios as he is in this film. Anyway, my rating for Star Wars, you can call it A New Hope if you want, I guess, to differentiate it, out of 10, I'm going to give this a 7. Very good. Now, in the past, I've given this a 6. I think sometimes I even gave it a 5 or a 4. I think that's a bit unfair. I'll give it a 7, but it is definitely my least favorite of the original trilogy, because it is a bit too simplistic. It is a bit too Flash Gordon-ish, more so than the sequels. But it is still a great example of like a perfect adventure film. It has perfect acts, although the first act I have issues with it, is too dragged out. But once we get into the second act and the third act, it gets much, much better. And the characters are well developed, and the situation and how they go from one adventure to another. They're on the desert fighting sand people, then they're freaking fighting their way from the Empire, trying to get out of the desert planet, and then they're on the Death Star, having to escape capturing, and then they go to the Rebel base trying to destroy the Death Star before it destroys them. Like, it's a great progression of an adventure story, and the mentor character dies, and he's inspiring with the Force, which I didn't really get into the Force in this, but maybe I'll save that for as Maz Kanata said another time. Anyway, so it's still enjoyable, it's still a great film, and even though I personally only give it a 7, I see why it is one of the classics, and why it will always be remembered and inspired so much more. Some of it better, some of it not so good. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this. May the 4th be with you, even if you're watching this after May the 4th, which you probably are, but whatever. I will be back next year. You have to wait an entire year, but I will be back next year to cover Empire Strikes Back. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to check out my channel as I cover a lot of other TV shows like Star Trek, The Expanse, and more. And if you really want to help me out and support the channel, please support me on Patreon. Just $1 a month will get you access to Patreon-only videos and many other special rewards out there. Would be greatly appreciated. But even if you don't want to do that, that's all good. You can be sure to subscribe to the channel. Also very much appreciated, so you can keep up with all the stuff I'm doing. And thanks a lot for watching.